In the rolling hills of Kentucky, 1902, where societal standards of beauty determined a woman's worth more than her character, 23-year-old Rose Henderson had learned to make herself invisible. Born with a severe burn scar that covered half her face, a cruel reminder of the fire that had claimed her parents when she was 5, Rose had endured a lifetime of whispered comments, averted gazes, and the crushing certainty that no man would ever see her as anything more than damaged goods. Working as a seamstress in the small town of Millfield, Rose spent her days creating beautiful dresses for women who would never need to wonder if they were worthy of love. He needed help managing his household, but more than that, he needed someone who wouldn't look at him with pity or treat him like a broken man who couldn't take care of himself. She had accepted her fate as a spinster, resigned to watching life pass by from the shadows, while others lived the dreams she had long ago abandoned as impossible. When Rose answered a newspaper advertisement for a housekeeper at a remote cattle ranch, she never expected to encounter Ethan Cross, a man whose own tragedy had taught him that the eyes can deceive, but the heart never lies. But fate has a way of writing stories that defy every cruel prediction. Blinded in a mining accident 3 years earlier, Ethan had retreated to his inherited ranch, convinced that his disability made him unfit for the world of the seeing. The farmhouse itself was a sturdy 2-story structure with a wraparound porch, painted white with green shutters that spoke of care and attention to detail. It was beautiful in a way that made Rose's chest tighten with longing for things she'd convinced herself she could never have. She had deliberately chosen to wear her best dress, a deep blue wool that she'd sewn herself, and arranged her auburn hair to fall across the left side of her face. She'd read about his blindness in his letter, but seeing it in person made her acutely aware of how different this encounter would be from any other job interview she'd endured. Usually, people took one look at her, and their expressions changed from interest to pity or disgust. This man's face showed only polite attention. Most people either ignored her scars completely or stared at them with morbid fascination, but Ethan's unseeing eyes held neither reaction, just polite attention focused on her voice. The very orderliness of it all made her more nervous. Surely a man capable of maintaining such a place would expect perfection from his employees. Though I confess, I was surprised when you wrote that you had no family references or personal connections to vouch for you. Most women seeking domestic positions have at least someone willing to speak for their character. A practiced habit that had become as natural as breathing. I keep to myself mostly, Mr. Cross. I've worked as a seamstress in town for the past 8 years, but I lived alone and didn't socialize much. Most young women your age are eager for social connections. Church socials, quilting bees, courtship. May I ask why you prefer solitude? Mrs. Patterson at the general store could vouch for my honesty in business dealings if you need a reference. How could she explain to this man that society had taught her she was too hideous to inflict her presence on others at social gatherings? I was in a fire as a child. The scars, they make people uncomfortable. They think it's catching, or a sign of God's displeasure, or just ugly enough to ruin their day. That mothers pulled their children away when she passed, and young men looked through her as if she didn't exist. But when he spoke, his words surprised her completely. You're better off without such people in your life, Miss Henderson. Their blindness is far more limiting than mine. Rose looked up to see a tall man in his early 30s, his dark hair slightly disheveled, as if he'd been running his hands through it. In 18 years of living with her disfigurement, no one had ever expressed sympathy for the cruelty she'd endured rather than pity for her condition. He'd adapted remarkably well to his blindness, organizing everything with mathematical precision that allowed him to function almost normally within his own domain. This ranch belonged to my grandfather, and I inherited it the same year I lost my sight. I've been managing alone for 3 months, but I'm afraid domestic duties aren't my strength. Without the weight of judgmental stares, she found herself speaking more freely than she had in years. I'm very organized by nature, and I believe people should be allowed to live their lives as they see fit. I need someone reliable, organized, and honest. Now, I have one final question, and I want you to be completely honest with me. Someone who won't treat me like an invalid or try to rearrange my life to suit their own ideas of what's helpful. Seemed like God's way of telling me I was meant to be here. Kitchen implements hung in specific locations, furniture was positioned for optimal navigation, and supplies were stored in containers he could identify by touch. The unexpected kindness made her throat tight with emotion. I prefer the company of my sewing and my books to the whispers and stares that seem to follow me wherever I go. Cave in at the copper mine where I was working as a foreman. Took 6 hours to dig me out, and by then... He shrugged, as if losing one's sight was a minor inconvenience rather than a life-altering tragedy. He wore clean work clothes and moved with the careful precision of someone navigating a world he couldn't see. I should warn you, I'm particular about my household routines. Everything has its place, and I need to be able to find things exactly where I expect them to be. No one had ever simply asked her directly about the source of others' cruelty. What neither Rose nor Ethan realized was that their meeting would prove that sometimes the most beautiful love stories begin when two people who believe they're unworthy of affection discover that perfection has nothing to do with what others can see. I apologize for not meeting you at the road. I'm still learning to gauge distances by sound, and wagon wheels can be deceptive. If you believe that true beauty comes from the heart, not the mirror, hit that like button. Share your thoughts about how society judges worth, and subscribe for more stories that show love's power to see beyond the surface. The October morning mist clung to the Kentucky hills like a shroud as Rose Henderson stepped down from the mail wagon, her single carpet bag clutched tightly in her gloved hands. The Cross Ranch stretched before her in rolling green pastures dotted with grazing cattle, more prosperous-looking than she had dared to hope from the newspaper advertisement. Smoke curled from the chimney, and Rose could see neat vegetable gardens and well-maintained outbuildings that suggested this was a working ranch run by someone who took pride in his property. "Miss Henderson, I presume?" The voice came from the porch, deep and measured, carrying the educated accent of someone who'd received proper schooling. "Yes, sir, Mr. Cross," Rose replied, then caught herself speaking to his general direction rather than his face. Ethan Cross descended the porch steps with one hand trailing along the railing, his movements confident despite his obvious care. There was no self-pity in his voice, just a matter-of-fact acknowledgement of his limitations that Rose found refreshingly honest. "No need to apologize, sir. I can manage just fine." "I'm sure you can," Ethan said, and Rose detected something that might have been amusement in his tone. "Your letter suggested you're quite capable." Rose felt heat rise in her cheeks, the familiar shame that came whenever she had to explain her isolated existence. Interesting, Ethan mused, beginning to walk toward the house with Rose falling into step beside him. The question was asked gently, without judgment, but it still made Rose's hand instinctively move to adjust her hair over her scarred cheek. "I find people can be unkind," she said finally, choosing her words carefully. Ethan stopped walking and turned toward her, his sightless eyes seeming to focus on her face with uncanny accuracy. "Unkind about what?" The directness of the question caught Rose off guard. In her experience, people either pretended not to notice her disfigurement or whispered about it behind her back. My appearance, Mr. Cross," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. Ethan was quiet for a long moment, and Rose prepared herself for the familiar awkwardness that always followed such revelations. "How terrible for them," he said simply. To be so shallow that they judge a person's worth by something as meaningless as scars. Rose stared at him, speechless. "Now then," Ethan continued, resuming his walk toward the house, "let me show you around and explain what the position would entail." The next hour passed in a blur of practical discussion as Ethan showed Rose through the house, explaining his systems for managing daily life without sight. "The accident happened 3 years ago," he explained as they toured his study, running his fingers along shelves of books organized by subject and size. "I'm sorry," Rose said softly. "Don't be. I've learned that pity helps no one, and I have more blessings than complaints. The previous housekeeper left suddenly to care for her sick mother," Ethan explained, as they concluded the tour in the kitchen. "I understand completely, Mr. Cross," Rose said, surprised by how comfortable she felt in his presence. "Excellent," Ethan said, settling into a kitchen chair and gesturing for Rose to do the same. Rose tensed, expecting him to ask about her scars or her lack of social connections, perhaps to request that she show him the extent of her disfigurement so he could decide if it would be too disturbing to his visitors. "Can you cook?" Ethan asked seriously. "Because I've been living on burned eggs and overcooked beef for months, and I'm beginning to think I might starve to death before I find proper help. Miss Henderson, if you're willing to tolerate a stubborn blind man who occasionally walks into furniture and has strong opinions about where his coffee cup belongs, the position is yours." "Yes, Mr. Cross, I can cook quite well. My mother taught me before the fire. I've been taking care of myself for 8 years now." And for once didn't immediately turn away from the scarred face looking back at her. Despite his blindness, he possessed a sharp wit, extensive knowledge of literature and music, and a gentle humor that made their daily conversations the highlight of Rose's existence. Rose learned that Ethan had taught himself to identify different birds by their songs, could tell when rain was coming by subtle changes in air pressure, and had memorized the location of every fence post on his property. He would stand on the porch in the early dawn, head tilted to catch sounds that told him stories about his land. The distant lowing of cattle, the rustle of wind through different types of grass, the particular creaking of the barn door that meant the latch needed repair. Now I realize how much I was missing because I was only using my eyes. I can tell you're smiling right now just by the change in your voice. I know when you're worried by the way you move through the house. I understand you better than I ever understood people I could see perfectly." For the first time in her life, someone valued her thoughts and opinions, engaging her in discussions about books, politics, and philosophy, as if her scarred face didn't make her unworthy of intellectual companionship. "How do you know I'm smiling?" Your voice gets lighter, warmer. It's like listening to music instead of just conversation. For the first time in her adult life, she was in a place where her appearance didn't matter, where she would be valued for her abilities rather than judged for her flaws. She found herself sharing memories she'd kept locked away for years. Her mother's gentle hands teaching her to embroider, her father's laughter filling their small house before the fire claimed them both. The dreams she'd harbored as a child before the world taught her that dreams weren't for girls like her. Her voice, rusty from disuse, gradually strengthened and soared through the farmhouse like something sacred returning to life. She sang of being lost and found, of blindness and sight, of grace that could transform the most broken soul into something whole and precious. Rich and warm, with a slight musical quality that makes even grocery lists sound like poetry. I find myself wondering, do you sing? Ethan slipped on the icy porch steps and twisted his ankle badly, leaving him temporarily dependent on Rose's assistance for basic mobility. Apparently, having a mysterious woman living at my ranch has set tongues wagging. What kind of questions? What could have been an embarrassing reminder of his limitations instead became an opportunity for deeper intimacy as Rose helped him navigate his temporary, increased helplessness with matter-of-fact kindness. Involved, whether I'm taking advantage of your position. Ethan's jaw tightened with anger. I told them my housekeeper's appearance was none of their business, and my personal life was even less so. I may not be able to see your face, but I can hear your heart in every word you speak, feel your compassion in every kindness you show me. Rose would read to him by the firelight while snow fell outside, her voice painting pictures more vivid than any his eyes had ever seen. Ethan would share memories of his life before the accident, and Rose found herself opening up about her childhood before the fire, the dreams she'd once harbored, the person she'd been before the world taught her to hide. And sense your beauty in ways that have nothing to do with how you look and everything to do with who you are. Before the fire, I sang in the church choir. Then you wouldn't be you, he said simply, and I can't imagine wanting anyone else. My mother said I had a gift, but afterward, people would stare, and I thought my appearance made my voice seem false somehow, like I was pretending to be something beautiful when everyone could see I wasn't. The unexpected question, delivered with such grave concern, made Rose laugh, a genuine surprised sound that she hadn't heard from herself in years. Rose had dreaded this encounter for weeks, knowing that Grace would judge her appearance and find her unworthy of her brother's affections. In the months you've been here, you've become the most important person in my world. Not because I'm blind and need help, but because you're intelligent, kind, funny, and genuine in ways that make every day brighter just by being yourself. She possessed an encyclopedic knowledge of wildflowers, could predict his moods by the way he moved through the house, and had a memory for detail that amazed him. Rose would describe the colors of the sunset in such vivid detail that Ethan could almost see the purple and gold painting the Kentucky sky. She would tell him about the hawk that had been hunting mice in his barn, or the way the cattle gathered under the old oak tree when storms approached. In return, he would share stories of his childhood on this same ranch, his dreams before the accident. Then, with gentle authority, he said, "Sing for me now," and his gradual acceptance that blindness had not ended his life, but simply changed its direction. "I'm asking you to share something beautiful with someone who would treasure it. Will you deny me that simply because others were too foolish to appreciate what they were hearing?" When she described the way morning light fell across his kitchen table, or how the changing seasons painted his pastures in different shades of green, her words created pictures more vivid than any his eyes had ever captured. "Thank God," Ethan said with obvious relief. Rose felt something unfamiliar bloom in her chest, hope mixed with belonging, as if she'd found a place where her presence was truly wanted rather than merely tolerated. "I'd be honored to work for you, Mr. Cross." As Rose settled into the small bedroom off the kitchen that would serve as her quarters, she caught her reflection in the mirror. What she didn't yet understand was that Ethan Cross's blindness would teach her to see herself in ways she'd never imagined possible. Rose threw herself into managing Ethan's household with a dedication that went far beyond mere employment. She learned his routines, anticipated his needs, and gradually began to understand that his careful organization wasn't just practical. It was his way of maintaining independence in a world that often treated disabled people as helpless. The weeks that followed transformed both their lives in ways neither had expected. More importantly, she discovered that Ethan was nothing like the bitter, withdrawn man she'd expected to find. Every morning brought small revelations about each other. Ethan discovered that Rose had read more books than most college professors, having spent lonely evenings immersed in literature that transported her far from her painful reality. Their conversations over dinner became the anchor of both their days. "I used to think sight was everything," Ethan admitted one evening as they sat on the porch listening to crickets begin their nightly chorus. Rose felt her cheeks warm at his perceptiveness. "Because you sound different," when you're happy. It was during these quiet evening talks that Rose began to let her guard down completely. "Rose," Ethan said one evening, as she read aloud from a volume of Shakespearean sonnets, "may I ask you something personal?" Rose's hand instinctively moved to her cheek, even though she knew he couldn't see the gesture. "Of course." "You have the most beautiful voice I've ever heard," he said quietly. The question brought tears to Rose's eyes. "I used to," she whispered. Ethan was silent for a long moment. "I couldn't possibly—" "Rose." His voice carried a firmness she'd rarely heard from him. Trembling, Rose began to sing a hymn her mother had taught her years ago, Amazing Grace, the melody flowing from her lips like water from a spring. When she finished, Ethan's face held an expression of wonder that made her heart skip. "Perfect," he breathed. "Absolutely perfect." The transformation accelerated when the first snow fell in December. "I should probably warn you," Ethan said one morning as Rose helped him to his chair, "the townspeople have been asking questions about you." Rose felt familiar dread settle in her stomach. "The usual small-town nonsense, whether you're pretty, whether we're—" "You defended me," Rose said wonderingly. "Of course I did." Ethan turned toward her with that uncanny accuracy that still amazed her. "Rose, I need you to understand something." Rose's breath caught in her throat. "Ethan, let me finish," he said gently. "I know you think you're unworthy of love because of your scars, but I also know that you're wrong." During those winter weeks of his recovery, their relationship deepened beyond mere friendship. "Sometimes I wonder," Rose admitted one evening, "what I might have become if I'd never been burned, if I'd been beautiful like other women." Ethan reached across the small space between their chairs and found her hand. The moment of truth came on Christmas Eve, when Ethan's sister Grace arrived unexpectedly from Louisville, with her husband and children. Grace's reaction was everything Rose had feared. The sharp intake of breath, the barely concealed shock, the protective way she positioned herself between Rose and Ethan, as if Rose's disfigurement might somehow be contagious. "Ethan," Grace said carefully, "perhaps we could speak privately." "Absolutely not," Ethan replied firmly. "Anything you have to say can be said in front of Rose. But surely you don't understand." "I understand perfectly." Ethan moved to Rose's side, his hand finding hers with practiced ease. "I understand that you're judging a woman you've known for 5 minutes based solely on her appearance. And Rose, meet my sister Grace, who I hope will learn to see you the way I do, as absolutely perfect. She's intelligent enough to discuss philosophy and literature for hours, kind enough to nurse a grown man through a twisted ankle without complaint. Those who came expecting to whisper about the blind man and his scarred bride found themselves witnessing something that silenced every cruel tongue, a love so genuine and joyful that it transformed everyone who witnessed it. "You are my light in every darkness," Rose sang for the gathering, her voice soaring through the Kentucky twilight, while Ethan listened with a smile of pure contentment. They would see Rose singing as she tended her garden, Ethan listening with a smile that spoke of absolute contentment. Ethan would sit in the front row, his face glowing with pride as his wife's voice filled the sanctuary with beauty that had nothing to do with what could be seen and everything to do with what could be felt. And their children, playing without any awareness that their parents had once been considered broken by a world too blind to see their true value. Even Grace, who had traveled from Louisville with her family, found herself moved to tears by the obvious happiness radiating from the newlyweds. Talented enough to turn this house into a home, and beautiful enough to make me grateful every day that she chose to share her life with mine. Drop a comment and tell us about someone who saw your real worth when the world couldn't. Hit that like button if this story touched your heart and reminded you that we're all perfect to someone who loves us truly. Subscribe for more incredible stories that prove love conquers every shallow judgment and shows us what really matters. Share this with someone who needs to remember that their scars, visible or invisible, don't define their worth. The right person will call you perfect exactly as you are. I understand that you think I'm somehow being deceived or taken advantage of because I can't see her scars. And I understand that you're about to insult the woman I love, which means this conversation is over. Rose gasped at his casual use of the word love. But Ethan wasn't finished. Who taught me that the heart sees what the eyes never could. You are and always will be perfect to me. Grace, meet Rose Henderson, the most remarkable woman I've ever known. He turned toward Rose, his hands gently framing her face, scarred and unscarred sides alike. The wedding took place the following spring in the garden behind the farmhouse, with half of Millfield in attendance. As Ethan spoke his vows, his hands holding Rose's face with infinite tenderness, his words carried across the gathering like a benediction. To my beautiful Rose, Rose's own vows, spoken through tears of joy, completed the circle of their love. To my dearest Ethan, who showed me that I was never broken, just waiting for someone who could see my true self. The celebration continued long into the evening, with music and dancing that brought the entire community together. Years later, visitors to the Cross Ranch would remark on the extraordinary happiness that seemed to radiate from every corner of the property. The local church often invited Rose to sing at special services, and she would take the stage with confidence, her scars no longer hidden but worn like badges of survival. This story reminds us that real beauty lives in the heart, not the mirror, and that true love sees what others miss completely.